Welcome to NewYorkBIOs virtual breakfast series, a digital program started in 2020, bringing you fireside chats with leaders from across the healthcare spectrum. This week, we welcome Ginger Davis of the Sickle Cell and Thalassemia Patients Network.
So, good morning, everyone. My name is Jennifer Hawks-Bland, and I'm the CEO at NewYorkBIO. We're thrilled you're here to join our conversation with Ginger Davis this morning as we talk about all things patient advocacy, and particularly sickle cell and the treatments that are being developed when you're looking at this condition. So special thanks to PHCBI, who has been our partner for this month of issues of our virtual breakfast series. A housekeeping matter, as I always try to remember to remind you, for those of you who might not have joined us before, welcome. And please put your questions for Ginger that you have throughout our discussion in either the Q&A box or the chat. That's how we'll recognize your questions and be able to ask those of Ginger or to steer us in an interesting topic of conversation as we get going. With that, I will turn it over to Derek to do a more formal introduction, and we'll get our conversation started. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Ginger, good morning. It is wonderful to have you here. And, this really kicks off one of our favorite things, which is, talking to folks about patients, about the voice of the patient, and about how we're going to keep integrating their viewpoints and their perspective into the R&D and innovation spectrum. As many of you know, we held our first ever patient engagement summit last spring. We're going to have another one coming up the end of April or beginning of May, and we are super excited to have you here. So we tend to kick these off with a bit of an origin story. You had a wonderful bit of a monologue at the beginning of our annual meeting. So why don't you tell us a little bit about how you got to where you are today, and we'll kick off the discussion.
Okay, first I want to say good morning to you and to Jennifer and to your audience. I'm really excited to be here and have this opportunity to speak with all of you again. And wow, my origin story. I'm just going to give a little bit of facts about sickle cell disease. It's a genetically inherited disorder. Two adults carrying a trait, they get together. There's a 1 in 4 chance with each pregnancy that you can have a child with the disease, a 50% chance to pass on the trait. And statistically, 2 out of 5 is basically 2 out of 5 children may be born with sickle cell disease. So in my family, I was a classic 2 out of 5. I was the second child to be born with sickle cell, but the only one to survive. My brother, Mark Anthony, died at 18 months, undiagnosed and untreated for a simple complication. And my mom was 6 months pregnant with me when that happened. So at his funeral, and my parents are immigrants, and my mother, English was not our first language. So at his funeral, the elders were saying, when she went to go put flowers on his casket, they grabbed her and said, "Don't do that. The baby might catch what he has." Sure enough, I caught it. And as far as I know, on either side of the family, Mark Anthony and I were the only two to have sickle cell disease. So I've been looking and asking, and we had a family newsletter, and no one else on either side of the family. We had traits, but no disease. So I say that, the one that survived, and I was fortunate. We had a neighbor next door who was a nurse at Long Island College Hospital, which is a teaching hospital. And also they had the Lambs Institute, which was doing research on metabolic and genetic disorders. So, walked my mom to the hospital, took her straight to Dr. DePillo, who was running the Lambs Institute at the time. And I was tested. And from that, I was immediately put into care at 2 years old. And I grew up, being cared for by 2 amazing physicians, Mary Kaufman and Dr. Dominic Sabatino, who trained, a couple of generations of amazing doctors, some of who are still in practice today, taking care of children with sickle cell disease and helping them to grow up and grow older, rather than this standard of dead before 5 or dead before 20. Our population has been living and thriving, but not in the best of ways. People here in the country are living with this disease and suffering.
Right.
So just to be, so a little bit for the edification of the audience, the sickle cell disease is caused by having two recessive versions of a particular gene, right? And if you have one recessive version of the gene, it's called sickle cell trait, correct? So there's actually another kind of step down which presents additional complications. Is that correct?
That is correct. And you can actually inherit two separate genes and not have the disease. And sometimes it manifests with some symptoms. And we do have people with trait who are symptomatic and they have been told all their life, oh, this will never bother you. Now, the health industry researchers are now looking at that and saying, no, that's not absolutely the truth. And because people are dying, they've been dying in the military, they've been dying in sports, and rhabdomyolysis, which is a condition that they from overexertion is just like having a sickle cell crisis. And some people have become completely disabled after having a bad bout of rhabdomyolysis. So, we'll get to that a little later, but, sickle cell trait is also a concern for us and who's actually affected. And we'll talk about that later too.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that I think is important, and I would like to hear, your take on this. So when you were younger, there were obviously a lot of misconceptions about the disease. Do you feel like the level of education in the community, whether it's doctors, whether it's parents, or whether it's health systems, do you feel like the level of education has gotten to the point where we understand how and when to diagnose it, we understand how to communicate to people, how to live with it, how to look out for certain things, how to care for your kids? Do you feel like we're there in terms of education within the community, or do we still have a long way to go?
Long way. It's like we've barely made any movement forward. I talk with people every day. I have people, sending me direct messages from Facebook about just yesterday. I actually advocated for a young woman in Kansas City, Missouri, who was being denied treatment because of the perception that she's either going to have a euphoric effect or be addicted to a non-opioid drug that's supposed to treat her pain. So she didn't know what to do. The advocate that was working her, is a lovely person. And there were some things that she didn't know because, for one, the community was being lied to, like how they could complain to get problems resolved in the hospitals. They were being told that they could not speak to the administrator on duty. They only could complain to the patient advocate. And I'm like, since when? And, they had policies instituted to do and not to do things. But when they ask for the policies are never forthcoming. And nobody that they speak to can actually produce a policy saying that we don't do this and you can't have that. We're still having residents and attendings asking people, when did you get sickle cell? Or
really?
Yes.
As
still.
if it were a contagious disease.
Yes.
Right.
When did you get it? And so education is not happening in the
Yeah.
community. It's not happening in academia,
Yeah.
where health sciences are being taught to these people who are now becoming doctors. And when you come into the hospital, they're teaching you all of the wrong stuff, the bad things. They're drug addicted. I actually was in the hospital visiting someone and heard an attending tell his students, how the other patients ask for drugs all the time. This one asks for blood. She's like a vampire. And this person who was over 40, was told by the geneticist at the hospital, who was senior to this attending, that when your blood count goes to 7 or below, before it even gets past 7.5, you may need to be transfused, because this person would usually end up in ICU when their hemoglobin got to 6 to 7 or below that. And so she's telling this attending wasn't on a hematological floor, I may need to be transfused. And that was his response to her request. And this is what he was teaching the residents. So I had to speak up at that point and say, oh, are you mad? That is not what you're supposed to be doing for your patient and how you should be teaching your students. And I said, matter of fact, why don't we get on the phone and call the doctor and ask her what she told the patient, and you tell her what your response was. And so the education, I feel I had more education growing up than what I see happening today. especially in the adult medicine. You have people who are now starting to uh, experience complications in stage 5 because they were never monitored annually or biannually to make sure that this complication wasn't happening. And if it was progressing, what kind of measures could be taken to slow it down or prevent it? So people are finding out in stage 5 that they have complications like avascular necrosis, which is the joints, the shoulder and the hip joints. The head would deteriorate and the shoulder and the hip would collapse. So that has to be replaced. But there are therapies that can prevent that from happening.
Yeah.
And people are still having surgery today when they don't have to because they're not being checked and other therapies are not being made available.
So Ginger, let's take some of the medicine you're preaching and let's level set a little for our audience, right? So, because we obviously, like our virtual breakfast series audience is very broad cross section of our life sciences industry. And so they may not have been exposed to information about sickle cell before. Talk to us just in the next, give us 2 to 3 minutes of what is the disease progression and how do people, so that people, as we talk today, people will understand when you're talking about stage 5, I think everyone thinks cancer stage 5. Well, that's too late. So talk to us about sickle cell and how that progress traditionally happens. And then we'll talk about, potential treatments and cures down the road.
Right. So again, it's a genetically inherited disease where the mutation happens on the beta globin chain in the hemoglobin molecule. So it affects the hemoglobin in the blood. It causes the blood to, the red blood cell to go from soft and pliable to elongated. It causes the hemoglobin to elongate, and that causes the cell to sickle. So you'll see a crescent moon or some other really weird shapes, and they become pointy. And what happens when whatever triggers the cell to sickle, it could be infection, it could be dehydration, it could be exposure to extreme cold, it could be food. Food can also be a trigger, and stress. What happens, it isn't just the red blood cells that's sickling, it also coagulates with the white blood cells. And then as they're passing through the blood vessels, when they get to the venules or the capillaries, they block those vessels. The clump becomes larger. And what happens? Inflammation starts to happen. It's the inflammation that causes the pain. Also, when this clot is going down the vein, it also damages the endothelial lining of the blood vessel wall. And so there's a couple of things happening. All of this contributes to the complications that you see in sickle cell disease. They are pervasive, they are varied, because it is the blood. Every organ and every organ system is susceptible to damage with this disease. So a sickle crisis in the brain is a stroke. Clots developing in your lungs is a pulmonary embolism. You have thrombophlebitis that turns into chronic venous stasis. From that, you will get things like leg ulcers because your valves in your femoral vein have collapsed in, and now the blood is going up and down, and eventually the person will get an ulcer, which is as painful as having a crisis. You have dysfunction in kidneys. The spleen usually is the first to go, and either will atrophy or it would swell. And when that happens, particularly in children, the first time the doctor's like, let's take it out. If it happens the second time, they're telling parents it absolutely has to come out because this is life-threatening. You have damage to the lungs. So acute chest syndrome is something that's a general, it's used to, well, we don't know if it's pneumonia. We don't know if it's, pulmonary hypertension. It's acute chest. So any respiratory complication, whether it's fever, there is fluid in the lungs, it's treated as acute chest, and it's sort of kind of treated like a combination between asthma and pneumonia. So they look to see if there's an infection, and the antibiotics are prescribed for that. You may receive albuterol, and you're definitely put on oxygen because you're already anemic and you're experience ischemic damage or loss of oxygen to tissues. It can put a lot of pressure on your heart, which is what causes pulmonary hypertension. It's not actually a pulmonary complication, it's a cardiac one. You have retinopathy, where you have it. Some people have a tendency for their retinas to detach, and that happens in stage 5. So without, having follow-up and maintenance care, people don't even know that these damage is happening to the vessels in their eye. And that's just kind of pervasive. And it happens really in the adult population, not so much the pediatric, because pediatricians, watch their children like a hawk. They protect the children like they're their own, and they're making sure that they're having their cranial Dopplers to see if there's any threat of stroke, if there's been any silent strokes, um, but not in adult medicine. All of that goes away once you age out of pediatrics.
So care tends to not only change, but actually diminish once you reach adulthood.
Right. Then you have other social determinants of care, your income, access to transportation.
Right.
If you did have a stroke, or a silent one or a severe one, your memory is affected. So you have cognitive deficits. And if you don't have something like a home health attendant or a nurse coordinator who's making sure that you get to appointments, a lot of those things are missed. So the continuity in care is not the same, because adult treatment programs were systematically closed between the 80s, the late 80s and the early 2000s, and there are only a few hospitals in New York that have dedicated adult comprehensive treatment programs.
So, I listened to all of this, and, all of this screams for intelligent folks that are advocating on behalf of the patient, right? Because just everything you talk about has a level of either misunderstanding, misdiagnosis, patients who can't necessarily speak or clarify things for themselves, nor should they necessarily have to be. So just to take a little step to the side, how did you get involved in patient advocacy in the first place? How did you find your way to the role that you have now?
The first time I advocated, I was actually 3 years old, and I can remember it in vivid detail. I was in the hospital, a toddler, and they used to, those cribs they looked like cages. They really did. And this adult walked by and said, "Look at the monkeys in the cage." And I'm like, "Who are you calling a monkey? We're not monkeys, we're children." And, so I told my doctor, Dr. Kaufman came in, and I told her, and she said, "Don't worry about it. We're not going to be here much longer." And, the hospital we were at the time, she left because she had gotten the pediatric director's position at Long Island College. So she took all her children with her. And we didn't have that kind of thing going on at Long Island College. So I miss my hospital. Cuomo is one of the bad things you did. He, sold it off to real estate developers. But I digress. But at 8 years old, I decided, the thought came to me, and I decided at 8 that I was going to become an advocate in honor of my brother. Mm-hmm. And my mom was an advocate, she'd already lost a child. She was being told every single year until I turned 10 that she was going to lose the second one, until I finally screamed at the doctor and said, "Stop telling her that. You're making her crazy. She's making me crazy." Because if you tell me I can't, it's like, watch me, so all of this, you shouldn't run, you shouldn't jump, you shouldn't do this. Right. I was a tomboy, and I was scaling the building and climbing trees and racing bikes and, sprinting with the guys, and I'd be out of breath, but I would always win. I was the fastest on the block. I played baseball, I played, tackle football and two-hand touch and volleyball. I did it all. And, until I was a teenager, it used to make my mom crazy. So she was, afraid of that crisis that was going to kill us. And it wasn't just her, it was like all of the parents. And so I decided to become an advocate. And what I would do when I was in the hospital is, I was also a night owl. So, during late nights, I'm sitting at the nurse's station with the nurses, and I'm reading the physician desk reference and understanding it. So I'm reading all of this stuff, and I would ask questions, and we were taught to be able to recite our care. Our last hospitalization, what the complications were, what medication, what doses, what we're taking, what our blood counts were. So when they would come in and, a 6-year-old was telling them all of this stuff in detail, but all of us, Cooley's anemia, cystic fibrosis, asthma, sickle cell disease, we were all taught, that way. So I had, the science background as a child and excelled in that. So I would start to speak up for the other children when somebody wasn't coming fast enough to get them a glass of water to help. I'd be in pain, but I always thought, well, they're suffering more than me. And I would get up out of the bed and go pour the glass of water and hold it for them to drink. Or I'm leading myself now, change the hot water bottle. We had to literally boil water, make sure that cap was on tight, wrap it up, and then, help get, them comfortable, help each other get comfortable. So that was the first iteration of my advocacy, was taking care of my friends, taking care of all the babies. When I got better, the nurses only had to come in to give their medication and take a report. I did everything else, especially for my little boys with hemophilia. I mean, they were twins and they were my absolute darlings. And then it became, when I became a teenager, it was educating myself and others about the disease we were living with. What I was noticing was food was a trigger for me. And so I started saying, well, I stopped eating beef and pork and kidney beans, because it was always seen when I ate beef and beans in the same meal, I was in crisis in the middle of the night. Dehydration from vomiting and diarrhea, and then crisis. And so I stopped eating it. And I'm a kid eating beets. Children don't like beets, but I ate beets because I was told it was good for me. And so I started changing my diet. Had a little pushback from mom because I was I was refusing to eat certain things. And it took a year when I decided that I wanted to become a vegetarian. It took a year for my mom to notice I didn't have a cold. I didn't get pneumonia. I didn't have crisis. I wasn't in the hospital. And so she stopped fighting me. So I started talking to people about nutrition and diet. Eating healthy, drinking a lot of water. Maybe milk is not the best thing for you. It wasn't for me. I loved baby bell cheese. Go in the middle of the night, take off that little that wrapper and eat it, and then be constipated for 2 weeks and finally in crisis. So sorry guys, I know it's early in the morning. But that was the life story. And so I started eliminating things that I was recognizing was making me sick. And so what did I do? I started telling my friends, track what you're doing, maybe keep a journal. Everything I got stored in here, but you need to write it down because you need to be able to prove this to the doctor. And one of the reasons I really addressed the food situation, because the food in the hospitals are atrocious. I mean, it wasn't so bad when we would go, but it got worse. When microwave ovens came in, we were just basically eating, warmed over plastic. I mean, it was bad and salty and all these things. So, most of the time I was getting home cooked food or somebody was going out and get something for me. And that still is the case today. If I should be in the hospital, it's like I have to bring food in because I can't eat that stuff. Or I exercise my privilege and I would get food from the cafeteria, the employees' cafeteria. And I'm like, I call the dietitian. I'm like, what's on the menu today? Can I have some of that? Don't send me the stuff that on the assembly line for the other patients. I'm not eating it. So that's the power of being an advocate, because you get to know department heads and things like that, and when you need something, it's like, hey,
and so you've given us a very good example, and this happens in your case. It's a lifelong condition, right? And in other situations, someone does contract a disease and they have to become an expert overnight. They have a spinal cord injury, they have to figure it all out, right? So it's like drinking from the fire hose. They don't have the luxury of the hard-earned knowledge that you have, right? That you share with others. So how did you decide that you needed to go from, talking to your friends, talking to other patients in the hospital, to really saying, okay, we need to formalize this and we need to speak out for patients even more broadly? You were talking about advocating for a woman, in the Midwest over the last couple of days. Talk to us about how what made you decide, okay, wait, we really need to make this more equitable and more broad for all of those people suffering from sickle cell and thalassemia?
There were a couple of things. My mom was involved with a group that was started in the 70s for sickle cell, and really they would have luncheons and raise money and give the young adult scholarships. But being there, she would drag me to the meetings, and I would listen and learn, and then when I got older, they would put me to work. But it was what I was seeing happening with cystic fibrosis, Cooley's anemia, hemophilia. They were organizing. They were developing organizations. They were raising funds. And I'm saying, well, why aren't we doing that? we're on pediatrics, and a patient with cystic fibrosis or Cooley's anemia, I think it was Cooley's anemia first, didn't have to pay for television, or a television was bought for them, and they had it. So I got money raised and bought a television for sickle cell. And when I wasn't around, they were taking our TV and giving it to the other kids. And when our children asked for it, it's like, yeah, so somebody actually went and poured water in the back of, top of tube televisions now, and destroyed the TV. So when they started, bringing those little TV units into the room, and then you had to pay for it, Cystic and Cooley Foundation, they were paying for those children's television. And sickle cell disease, we're paying out of pocket. And at first it was cheap, but now it's like $10, $15 a day. And most of our population are on Social Security, insurance, they're on Medicaid, they're on or Medicaid managed care, they're on rent subsidies, and living below the poverty level. Nationally, it's $17,000 annually. Disabled people with government subsidies are living below that. And so to expect people to have to pay $10, a day or more to watch a television, to keep them, and it's really just to keep you distracted and keep you from focusing on the pain. That's what it's for.
Right.
I bring my laptop. I work, but it's ridiculous, and it's a burden. And so I'm seeing these things, and I'm like, we have to do more. And I kept trying. The other thing I was noticing was the adults didn't want to leave pediatrics. I mean, we had 25-year-olds on peds, and it's like, isn't there something wrong with that? I mean, we all grew up together, and mine, but I'm thinking legally, isn't this a problem? We didn't really have any funny business going on, but times were beginning to change, and there was at least one or two incidents, and it's like they had to start moving the adults off the floor. When I turned 18, I volunteered to go. I'm like, I'm going to go check this thing out and see, why everybody doesn't want to go to adult care. I learned a little bit of that, but because, I was very vocal, I didn't really have too much problem. Also, I wasn't getting sick that much. I actually, from 11 to 15, no crisis. And then from 15 to about 21, no crisis symptoms. A few after that. And then I lived, most of my adult life crisis free. And so I wasn't experiencing the same things when I went into the hospital. I did go to college. I did study biology with the intent to go pre-med. I went into naturopathy instead. And, I was able to talk the lingo with the doctors, and I got what I wanted, what I needed. But I also knew I did not want to be a service patient. And I interviewed doctors and picked a private physician who was an internist, not even a hematologist. And he worked with hematology to coordinate my care. And today I still have a team. My hematologist is my primary care physician, but if I needed one, I also have a cardiologist on the team. I have my GYN, I have my ophthalmologist, I have pain management. I don't have to argue with anybody about what medication I'm taking, what the dose. My pain management physician or my hematologist will call and say, give her what she asked for, so and because I don't get sick often, I don't take the same amount of drugs that people who are inundated with pain every day or regularly do. My doses are very small in comparison.
Yep. Yeah. So we can transition a little bit here. I wanted to give you a little bit of an opening to talk about some of the therapies that are in development, because for the longest time, there was nothing. Right. And we'll actually go, I want to go back to social determinants of health at some point, because I think this is really important in terms of how we actually communicate with the healthcare system, how we communicate with our doctors. But I do want to spend a little bit of time on the fact that we are making some progress. So there's been a therapy in development. The first one that had come out, it was from Emmaus Life Sciences. And it was Dr. Yutaka Nihara. So can you talk a little bit about, your role within the community and the way that your communications changed when you actually had something that was going through clinical trials, that was actually kind of the first new hope for patients on the way?
It was exciting to know for the first time in more than 100 years, pharmaceutical companies were beginning to pay attention to sickle cell disease. Emmaus Life Science had been researching disease modifying medicinal therapies for more than 25 years. Dr. Miyahara was dedicated to that. And he was the first to go into clinical trial and the first to have a medication approved. Um, they reached out to the Sickle Cell Thalassemia Patients Network when Donette Carroll, one of the founding members, was still president. And, she told me, she was like, Ginger, I need help with this. And at the time, we were actually working with Pfizer on doing education around clinical trials because this stuff was happening now. Things were happening, and our community was absolutely apprehensive about participating in clinical trials. And so, we had to learn, we had to get comfortable with it, and we had to relate this information. And we started doing our polls, a public outreach and education series on clinical trials. We went to Albany with this. I mean, we were all over the place. And we started saying, we need to do this. And the people who were responding, even though they were a little afraid, were the young folks, the teenagers, the young adults. And they said, I'll do this. And they were sibling sets, which was great. And the older ones would say, even if it doesn't help me, if it helps my sister, or if it helps my brother, it helps other people, I'm willing to do this. Yes, I'm afraid, but I'm going to do this for the benefit of the community. And it was those young people that really started to encourage the older folks to get involved with clinical trials. And we continued. Coronavirus actually provided us a great opportunity. I mean, people could say a lot of bad things about the pandemic, and it was bad, but it provided an opportunity for us to broaden our audience. It helped us reach people virtually. Not only now do we have a national audience for our community connections where we talk to the community and educate them, we have an international audience that joins us on Zoom and Facebook for these monthly sessions. And then we created a virtual program for each one of our co-creators in the community, especially the clinical trials. So we created Lunch and Learn. And for an hour and a half on the third Thursday of the month, we bring in a different company to do their on-brand messaging about the trial that they're doing in sickle cell beta thalassemia. And for physicians, nurse practitioners, social workers, the people who are on the front line of healthcare, other advocates and CBOs, we bring all of these people in, even so, if we're lucky, getting professors who are teaching health sciences at colleges to come in. And we've had educators from across the country join our Lunch and Learn sessions, and then they're given a call to action to go and tell their patient about the trial, give them the opportunity to decide whether they want to participate. And then we back that up by going back to community connections with the chief medical officer and chief science officer, and having them explain it to the community. So if they don't hear it from their doctor, they can now go to the doctor and say, I want to check this trial out. Help me out. If I qualify, I want to participate in it. So we've been doing that, vigorously since 2017. And we're at the point now, we host an event, World Sickle Cell Day, and that is dedicated specifically to talking about treatment, talking about policy, talking about the disparities in healthcare and the social determinants and the research and the various symptoms, and having a conversation between, healthcare providers, administrators, legislators, and the community. Our community health workers are advocates. So we have people on the ground in the hospital trying to make things better, trying to make sure that the patients are staying compliant on their new protocols. In 2017, Indari came out with the mayor's, and in 2019, 2 years later, Novartis's Advocacy came out, and then Global Blood Therapeutics, Oxbryta. So we have 3 medications that were created specifically for sickle cell, and not, hydroxyurea was a repurposed medication. It is not a sickle cell medication. It was a chemotherapeutic medication that was found to raise fetal hemoglobin, and it was tested to see, is this going to work? And then it was very quickly approved when there was some positive effects showing that it could raise fetal hemoglobin but it also raises overall hemoglobin as well. But it was being used for the effect of increasing fetal hemoglobin or the baby hemoglobin. That's a buffer for sickle cell.
So I've posted the link to the Sickle Cell Thalassemia Patients Network website and some of your programs and activities in the chat that people can go to learn more about exactly what the organization does. You mentioned World Sickle Cell Day. That is in June, correct?
That is in June, June 19th. So in 2008, the 63rd United Nations General Assembly approved approved the resolution A63-237. I've been saying this for a long time. I found out about it. I found out about it in 2009. And the resolution was to recognize sickle cell disease as a serious world health concern and to begin developing, satellite research, treatment, sharing of information, improvement of treatments, more research, more medications in this document. And it also recognized June 19th as World Sickle Cell Day. This was a resolution that a woman from Congo Brazzaville went to her first lady and said, can you please get your husband to introduce this into the UN? We need to have something for sickle cell at the United Nations, being the most prevalent, genetically inherited disorder in the world. And so that happened 2005, 2008, it was approved. 2009, I found out about it. And I started calling all of the embassies. I'm like, hey, who's managing this thing? We want to do an event next year. And so in 2010, SCTPN did the first World Sickle Cell Day conference at the UN and a music festival at Dag Hammarskjöld Plaza, supported by the then Governor Basil Patterson. The Lieutenant Governor came out. We had 2 top-run radio stations there with us hosting that day at the festival in Dag Hammarskjöld. And then we had the conference inside. And somehow I wasn't planning on it, but somehow I found myself on the dais, sitting between the ministers of health, of countries and the first ladies and some doctors and stuff. And I'm like, how did I get here? They're like, Ginger, they're waiting for you. Go, because I'm running back and forth between the UN and Dag Hammarskjöld. And they're like, they're waiting for you. You got to be up there on the dais. I'm like, how did that happen? So I'm sitting up there like lost. What am I going to do? What am I going to say? And someone said something in the audience that provided me an opportunity to respond from the patient and advocacy side. And I guess everybody liked what I said, because there all of a sudden was a pause and standing, and I'm like, what's going on here? But I had to speak because a lot of times I go to conferences, I used to go to grand rounds and speak. And God bless doctors. I appreciate each and every one of you, especially the research physicians. But sometimes, folks come up with ideas that are not actually beneficial to the patient. So what's happening in the research sciences right now, I'm loving, because the words patient-centered and patient-focused are at the forefront of what's happening. They're looking to make sure that what we're getting ready to do is not going to harm, not emotionally, not mentally, not physically, not going to be life-threatening. What is it that we need? What is our major concerns? How can we best help you? That wasn't always happening. So a comment that wasn't really going to be beneficial was, made there, and I had to respond to it. And I'm like, your oath is to do no harm, and what you're saying is going to harm us. And, right now, worldwide, doctors are pushing hydroxyurea. But for the people who are taking it, who are having their hair fall out, who are losing their appetite, who are nauseous and vomiting, who can't eat, when they begin to feel worse taking the medication, they're not going to want to take it. And there are a lot of people who stop taking the medication and the doctors don't even know, because proper follow-up and tracking wasn't happening with these patients. So the doctor's finding out 3-6 months down the line that the person has stopped taking the medication because they didn't like the way they were feeling. They were feeling worse. And hydroxyurea is a medication that, it might take some time to settle. But when you're dealing with somebody who's severely impacted by the disease, if this is going to make me feel worse, I don't want it.
Yeah.
Right.
And those kind of things have to be considered, when drugs are being developed and when doctors are prescribing it. It works for about 20% because historically, over more than 10 years now, 20 years, you've only had 20% of the sickle cell population worldwide actually take this medication and take it with consistency. So, it's pushed as a standard of care, but those of
Yeah.
us who are advocates, people who've experienced that medication don't feel that. You
Right.
don't deny anybody else the right and opportunity to take it, but for the most part, the majority of the population don't want to take that or other medications like that.
So let's talk about, let's shift then and talk about potential for not only
Mhm.
treatments that have a different care burden, right, on the patient, but also the potential for curative treatments. We've had a
Mhm.
couple of questions from the audience that says several gene therapy technologies are in development or clinical trials, right, for sickle cell disease. How does the sickle cell community feel about gene therapy? And are there concerns that the scientific community should be aware of? So I think that goes to what we were just talking about.
Oh, I think we're flocking to the gene therapy. There are a lot of us who were waiting for it. When uh, stem cell therapy first came to public attention with Christopher Reeves and his accident, and the forays into can we cure his neurological complications, the damage to his spine with stem cells, and there was a lot of no, and this isn't ethical, and you're going to be taking unborn fetuses and all kind of crazy that was being spoken about. Some of us realized that stem cell therapy was going to be the answer for sickle cell disease. And little as it's known, the human genome got mapped because of sickle cell. It was the most researched metabolic disorder and genetic disease in humankind, and it helped scientists to map the human genome. And 20 years ago, geneticists were saying that sickle cell is the most curable genetic order in humankind. That we expect to cure this in the next 20 or so years. So moving, a little past the 20-year mark, um, we have, Dr. Tisdale from NIH, who's been on 60 Minutes a couple of times talking about his stem cell therapy. People no longer have the disease, but the throwback from that is if you started to experience complications from sickle cell, that you may no longer have sickle hemoglobin, being produced by your bone marrow. However, you can't get rid of the complications that you develop, and they can't get rid of them. So you're still being in treatment for that. Some people who have had bone marrow transplant ended up developing diabetes because of graft versus host disease. And so the response to GVHD is to do steroids, and so some of the therapies to keep people alive and, not have the stem cell or the bone marrow donations rejected can cause other complications. So for the most part, stem cell and gene therapy is working. We're still looking at what happens 10, 20 years down the line from going in and manipulating human genes. The next thing now is the gene editing. It's like, ooh, this is like, I'm gonna date myself again, Jetson stuff. We're in flying cars, and actually Paul Moeller made the first flying car in 1980. So we had that a while, but now people start to talk about it like it's new. And so now we have gene editing, and we're hopeful about that. We're also being cautious about what the side effects could be in the long run, but it has to happen, and we're excited about that. And people are not only joining trials, but they're sticking with it through the whole 4 up to 5 phases, because there is a phase 5, and that is after the trial is finished. If it's a medicinal therapy, you can still have it for the next year, and we're watching you, and so people are sticking with it all the way through. There are a couple of trials right now that are almost about to conclude, and they're going to go into the phase for approval. And by next year, we will have 1 or 2 new medications. One of them that I've been tracking since the 90s is finally in the clinical trial phase and just about to be wrapped up. So we're very hopeful with that one because it's a botanical therapy. And it's something that has shown, efficacy and done a lot of good, primarily in Africa where it was being used. So we're hopeful for that one. And the stem cell and the gene therapy gives us another layer of hope. But again, from my position, I'm looking at that's great, but when it gets approved, how much is it going to cost? Because I was looking at the EU when they approved stem cell, transplantation as a curative therapy, it costs $3 million. And so we're looking at whether you have an insurance that's paid or insurance that is government subsidized. Are these companies going to want to pay that price to, help people do away with the disease that's causing a lot of harm? And that's the conundrum that we're also looking at right now is we're being denied coverage for medication. So our company's going to want to pay $3 million up front. So I tell them, look at it this way: how much is it costing for a lifelong care for somebody with this hospitalization, medication, treatment? $3 million. So are you going to do this? And then again, that number 100,000, everybody knows we're more than 100,000. Are you going to be willing to do that for more than 100,000 people in this country, and all the influx of people who are going to want to come in to get it? Because we receive mail every week, messages every week. Can you pay for my visa, buy me a ticket, and put me up so I can come to America and get treatment? So
it's interesting. We sit in the cradle of probably the greatest era of biomedical innovation, and we have all of these hurdles that we need to jump over to get these medications to patients. So at least we have the first part moving, right? At least now we are moving the science in the right direction, and hopefully the other pieces of that problem are solvable. So we actually have something. I love it when this happens on this program. We have Molly Ryan, who's the Vice President for Government Affairs and Policy over at GBT, who wants to connect with you because they are trying to advance a legislative initiative that's going to create federal funding to support the hub and spoke model for those living with thalassemia, and they want to partner with SETPN. So we will connect you with her directly afterward. You got it.
I got your email. Good. I'm sorry that I haven't. It's just a bit crazy because we're transitioning. As you know, I'm the new president, so we're still transitioning. We're planning for this year's activities. We're trying to get funding, for events, and it's been a little crazy. But I will respond to you. I am aware of the legislation, and yes, we support it. We work with Hemophilia and von Willebrand's in our state to put on legislation, because we recognize at the time that they were doing legislation for step down therapy and pre-authorization that it was going to affect sickle cell, and so we jumped right on board and we do our legislative advocacy together. So yes, we will support that because we have members within our organization that do have thalassemia, not sickle cell, but thalassemia. So we say yes to that. We've supported cancer, we've supported HIV, AIDS. And so when it comes to advocacy, absolutely, yes, we will do what we can.
That's great to hear. I mean, one of the things that is, I think, really important is being able to facilitate this conversation, not only between patients and industry, but patients and the industry and advocates in the whole health system and the federal government. Because like we said, the biology is only one piece of the puzzle. And if these therapies don't actually get to patients, you don't actually see the advancement and the cures and people actually getting the benefit of all of the decades of hard work that go into the science.
Right. And one other piece that New York Bio has been doing as part of our work with the state is trying to encourage the state to seek a necessary waiver to look at alternative payment models. Right. And that's going to be really important. Yes. As we talk about the cost of new therapeutics.
So I really want, there's a couple of things that I wanted to get to very quickly. One, in terms of the new medicinal therapies, for the doctors out there, those of you who may be on here, and tell your colleagues, when the pharmaceutical reps come calling, knocking on the door for a meeting to introduce the medication to you, take the meeting. Because when you don't take the meeting and you're ignoring them, you are creating a barrier to the patient. Now we don't have access. Doctors are prescribing it, but if they go into the hospital, the medication is not there in the pharmacy. So people are either forced to bring their supply from home or do it out their medication for the time that it in. And the first thing the medical professionals do say, we're not compliant. But you don't look at all of the factors that cause people not to be compliant. Not having the medications available in the pharmacies in the hospital, or being available in the commercial pharmacies, is a barrier to healthcare. To companies that are doing research on things like inflammation, retinopathy, on bone degeneration, all of those research, Hemonex, cell care. There are so many of your companies that are doing some wonderful research for other health conditions, for macular degeneration, for diabetic retinopathy, that is, relevant to sickle cell. Sickle cell retinopathy is the thing. Sickle cell is categorized as a metabolic disorder, but it's also an inflammatory disorder because it is the inflammation that causes the retinopathy, that causes the pain. So we need to be considered for your pipeline for those trials. The other thing, World Sickle Cell Day. World Sickle Cell Day is going to be the biotech and biopharma's playground in June. So we actually are looking now at changing the dates from sorry folks, for those of you I told, the 14th to the 17th. I did that because World Sickle Cell Day actually falls on a Sunday, and I was not touching the Sunday. Now we're looking at touching the Sunday in a different way. We're looking at having a festival. This is year 14 for us. So we're looking at having a brief festival and moving the conference to Monday through Thursday, the 20th to the 24th, so that we can, the 20th to the 23rd, so that we can, have our 4 days, have, all of the companies that are doing trials right now present on their trials for the audience, to have some of the other companies that are doing things be introduced to sickle cell, to talk about policy, to talk about funding research, to talk about what comes after the research is approved and all of the money it takes to get that out to market. So we're covering, pretty much, a broad spectrum of this information. And that's going, so we're moving it to the 19th through the 23rd. We're looking at having the festival. We're looking at having it in Brooklyn at one of the universities here. I don't want to be, I've been calling people all over the place saying, can you please call these people and tell them to call me back, because I want to have my event at their campus. So we're looking to have it, and it's a beautiful match because they have a lot of biosciences there. Not only would it be a benefit to the students, we can engage some of the deans and the professors there at the college to moderate the workshops. So it's really meant from the bottom up, from A to Z, to address healthcare and the health industry from all aspects. Yes, we'll be talking about sickle cell a lot, but we're also going to be talking about the intersection between bleeding and clotting disorders, because we're starting to see some things now that's a relevant conversation. We're talking about policy for the first time. We're bringing in health payers, which I'm going to ask for both of your help on that, and even to bring in the investment industry, because we know companies like Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley, Dean Witter, and some of the banks are backing the biosciences, are backing this research. But now we need to come in and really see what the effect of their support is doing within the community. So we would like to have those institutions represented at this conference as well. So as soon as we finish making that change and confirming the location, I will share that information with you, and please help me to share it with the rest of the audience and the rest of our membership, because we're a member as well.
So yes, and so what you're talking about in June is a manifestation of bringing all of the pieces of the treatment and care and research together, sort of under one roof, right? So as you talk to our audience, which really covers that entire spectrum, right? What would you say to us beyond engaging with you in June, right? What is the most important thing for the patients that engage with the SCTPN to hear, right? What do we need to hear that gives us sort of a call to action?
Have a heart for sickle cell. We are people. We are people who are in pain. You can't see pain, and unless you felt something like this, you don't even really know what it's like. The 1 to 10 is not a realistic pain scale for somebody living with sickle cell disease or pyuria or rheumatoid arthritis and a number of other conditions where pain is a major symptom. It's not being addressed properly. We do need to have alternative non-opioid medications developed. We do need to have disease modifying medications that are addressing inflammation and the other complications. We do need people to take the time when you come into the room to listen to what we're saying. When we ring the call bell, it's not about the medication all the time. Sometimes is I can't lift my arm to pour a glass of water. Can you help me drink? Can you help get me to the bathroom? Can you help me turn over? Don't make assumptions. Stop perpetuating the negative um, myths about sickle cell that we're drug seekers and drug addicts, because I've really been looking for those statistics and there is nothing to substantiate that assumption that is being widely spread. People are being denied treatment in emergency rooms and on the floor because of this negative perception. And it's hurting and killing people. We need to have mental health services included in comprehensive care. Hello, psychologists, psychiatrists, social workers. We need to have that. We need to have insurances paid for that. You know, we need for our payers to start coming to some of these, you know, sickle cell and rare disease conferences and meetings to better understand how we work. We want to work together with people. We want you to understand and we want to understand. I'm always in the process of learning right now. I have, you know, 2 medical affairs people teaching me what they do. What are the nuances? You know, what is the language that I need to use to connect in that realm? I have 4 folks in public government relations that I've been working with for the last 3 years, and they have made me, you know, a real political animal. And, you know, I thank them so much for the time and the effort that they put into me to help me help other people. And because of, you know, what I've learned, we now have a political action committee with about 36 people in New York State, but we don't just do this in the state, we do this regionally and we do this across the country. We do this out of the country. As I said, we have an international following. So we're taking what we're learning, we're taking evidence, we're providing, you know, documentation from, you know, US scientists here and giving it to people in other countries and helping them to advocate for better treatment, for more money, you know, for consideration. And so when we're looking at this, you know, we need to take care of home first. Charity does begin at home. But in a couple of years, we want to start looking at what we can do internationally, how we can help other people. You know, just 90 miles off the coast of the US, people are not getting care and don't have access to medication. So we want to make sure our commonwealths, you know, we have a significant population in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, and they don't have what we have here, you know, on the continental US. So we're taking them in, you know, we're looking, talking to them about becoming chapters for SCTPN and affiliates. So now that we can begin to share resource. So I'm kind of putting everybody on notice that we're going to be going international. Get ready, because I'm going to be calling on all of you to help us doing this. And I know you're excited about doing this because this is what you're choosing to engage yourself in as a career, you know, and what you want to contribute to society. So know that we recognize it and we appreciate that.
So Ginger, thank you. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your decades-long advocacy, but most important, thank you for partnering with us and those in our community and the research and development community to help us better understand sickle cell disease and what we can do to make patients' lives better. So the conversation goes on, and we look forward to helping you with your conference in June. And we know others on the line who are listening today will want to do the same. So for now, we're signing off, but that doesn't mean you won't be hearing from Ginger or New York Bio on these important issues again. Thanks everybody for your time and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to New York Bio's virtual breakfast series. Join us every Tuesday at 9 a.m. for more discussions with leaders from across the healthcare spectrum. For more information on New York Bio, please visit us at www.newyorkbio.org.